The first thing you need to understand is that the Galactic Concordat has classified over 40,000 worlds in its 11,000-year history. 40,000 worlds. Moons, gas giant colonies, deep space habitats, underground civilizations carved into asteroids the size of continents. 40,000 places where something breathed, thought, built, and reached toward the stars. Out of those 40,000, only 14 had ever received the level 15 Deadworld classification. 14. Not because the classification was hard to earn. The criteria were brutally simple. If your world had produced life capable of threatening the structural stability of the Concordat itself, not just a fleet, not just a war, but the actual architecture of galactic civilization, you got the mark. 14 worlds in 11,000 years. When Earth received it, we were the 15th. And I was there. I was sitting in the observation gallery of the Concordat hearing chamber on Velshara Prime, and I watched it happen. I watched the moment the most powerful governing body in known space looked at my home planet, a pale blue dot orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the unfashionable outer spiral of the Milky Way, and decided, officially, formally, with all the bureaucratic weight of 11 millennia behind the decision, that we scared them. Really scared them. My name is Commander Yale Orvek. I'm a liaison officer with the Terran diplomatic delegation. I've been stationed off-world for 9 years. I've walked the halls of 4 different Concordat administrative stations, shaken hands, or the equivalent, with beings whose biology I still don't fully understand, and I've represented Earth in negotiations that would make most people's heads spin. But nothing prepared me for that day. Nothing prepared any of us. Let me back up, because the classification didn't come out of nowhere. There was a process. A long, agonizing, deeply uncomfortable process that started about 3 years before the final vote and involved more political maneuvering than anything I'd seen in my career. It started with the Vethara incident. If you're reading this from Earth, you probably know the official version. A Terran deep space exploration vessel, the Endurance Protocol, encountered a Vetharan military blockade near the Kessler Corridor. The Vetharans, who are tall, blue-gray, vaguely arthropod in structure, and deeply convinced of their own superiority, had been using the corridor as an unofficial toll road for about 2 centuries. Everyone in that region of space paid the fee. It was just how things worked. The Endurance Protocol didn't pay. Not because the captain, Commander Dara Solis, who I've met twice, and who has the calm demeanor of someone who has seen everything and been impressed by none of it, not because she didn't know about the toll. She knew. She just calculated that the toll was illegal under Concordat shipping regulations, specifically Article 7, subsection 14, of the Interstellar Transit Accords, and she transmitted that calculation to the Vetharan blockade commander, along with a polite but firm refusal to pay. The Vetharan commander responded by powering up weapons. Commander Solis responded by not moving. She just sat there, in the middle of the blockade, didn't raise shields, didn't arm anything, just held position and sent a second transmission that said, approximately, "We are aware that you are powering weapons. We are choosing not to respond in kind because we believe this situation can be resolved through legal channels. We are also transmitting this entire exchange to Concordat Regional Authority Station 7, to the Terran Diplomatic Corps, and to approximately 40 Concordat member species independent news networks. We'll wait." The Vetharan commander powered weapons down 40 minutes later. The Endurance Protocol passed through the Kessler Corridor without paying the toll. Commander Solis filed the legal challenge. 12 months later, the Concordat ruled in Earth's favor and the Vetharan toll system was dismantled. On Earth, this was a minor diplomatic win, a footnote. In the Concordat, it was something else, because the Vetharans had been running that toll for 200 years. Dozens of species had paid it. A handful had complained. None had done what Commander Solis did, which was to sit in front of an armed warship with her shields down and essentially say, "Go ahead. I'll wait for you to make the right decision." That's when people started paying attention to us differently. But the Vethara incident was just the beginning. The thing that really shook the Concordat, the thing that started the whisper networks, the private emergency sessions, the quiet reclassification proposals, was what happened on Gorath Station. Gorath Station was a Concordat-administered waypoint in deep space, neutral ground, the kind of place where every species docked their ships, traded goods, exchanged information, and generally pretended to get along. It had been running peacefully for about 400 years. Then the Kreth Dominion moved on it. The Kreth are, and I want to be careful here, because I've met individual Kreth who were perfectly decent. The Kreth Dominion as a political entity is essentially a protection racket that has been operating at galactic scale for roughly 3,000 years. They're large, they're aggressive, they have a fleet that would make most civilizations faint, and their standard approach to neutral stations is to show up, announce that the station is now under Kreth protection, and start charging for that protection whether anyone wants it or not. They'd done it 47 times, 47 stations over 3,000 years. No one had ever successfully stopped them. On Gorath Station, there were approximately 12,000 civilians from various species, and there was one Terran security contingent, 43 soldiers from the 7th Rapid Response Division under the command of a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Webb. 43. The Kreth protection fleet that showed up was 208 warships. I've read the transcripts, I've seen the sensor logs, I've talked to people who were there, and I still find the whole thing almost difficult to believe, even knowing how it ended. Lieutenant Colonel Webb contacted the Kreth fleet commander and informed him that Gorath Station was under Terran diplomatic protection pending full Concordat jurisdiction review, that any aggressive action against the station would be considered an act of war against Earth, and that he had already transmitted this notification to 3 separate Concordat emergency channels and 4 independent observer networks. The Kreth commander laughed, which is a sound that Kreth actually make, a low, reverberating pulse that their translator systems render as laughter because the emotional signature matches. He laughed, and then he told Webb that 43 soldiers were going to surrender or be destroyed, and that the Concordat channels Webb had messaged would receive the response in about 6 weeks given signal delay. Webb said, "Understood, we'll be here when they do." Then he sealed the station. What followed was a 19-day standoff, 19 days in which 208 Kreth warships sat outside Gorath Station while 43 Terran soldiers and 12,000 civilians waited inside. The Kreth cut power to the external docking rings. Webb's team rerouted. The Kreth jammed communications. Webb's team found 3 frequencies the jammers couldn't reach and used them in rotation. The Kreth sent boarding parties twice. Both times they were repelled. 43 soldiers, repelling boarding actions from 208 warships worth of Kreth Marines. The casualty reports from those boarding actions were, they were not pretty on either side, but the Terrans held. On day 19, the Concordat emergency response fleet arrived. The Kreth withdrew. Gorath Station was intact. All 12,000 civilians were alive. 18 of Webb's 43 soldiers were not. I knew 2 of them, not well, but I knew their names and I knew what they'd done, and I stood in a corridor of the Concordat administrative station when the news came through, and I didn't say anything for a long time. Sometimes there's nothing to say. The Concordat held a formal inquiry. The Kreth were censured. Webb received the Terran Distinguished Service Medal and the Concordat's Protector's Commendation, which had only been given out 11 times in 400 years. And in the closed chambers of the Concordat Oversight Committee, the reclassification proposal for Earth was formally introduced. I should explain what the classifications mean, because I think people on Earth don't really understand them. The Galactic Concordat uses a tiered system for member species. It covers everything: diplomatic standing, resource access, military capability assessments, threat evaluations. Most of it is administrative. Most species sit somewhere in the middle ranges and move up or down based on economic development, population growth, technological advances. Normal stuff. The upper classifications, 12, 13, 14, 15, those are different. Those aren't about development. Those are about what happens when a civilization reaches a certain threshold of capability combined with a certain threshold of there's no perfect translation for the Concordat word. The closest I can get is irreducibility. When a species becomes something that the Concordat cannot predict, cannot contain, and cannot comfortably define, it gets pushed toward the upper classifications. Level 12 is significant military presence. About 300 species sit there. It means you have a fleet that could seriously hurt someone, but you're manageable. Level 13 is strategic deterrence tier, 46 species. You have enough firepower that starting a war with you would be genuinely costly, and everyone knows it. Level 14 is galactic power, 9 species. You're one of the big players. Your decisions shape the Concordat. Other species calculate their moves around you. Level 15 is Deadworld classification. That name is misleading. It doesn't mean a dead world. It means a world that has proven, through its history, its biology, its demonstrated behavior, its capacity for both creation and destruction, that it represents an existential variable in the stability of the Concordat itself. A world whose existence in the galactic community changes the fundamental equation. The 14 previous level 15 classifications had all been given to species that were, at the time, either extinct or effectively neutralized, absorbed into the Concordat's power structure, fragmented, or reduced to a state where they no longer functioned as independent actors. Earth was going to be the first level 15 civilization that was still completely intact, still growing, still reaching. I found out about the proposal the way I found out about most things in those days, through Counselor Veth. Counselor Veth was my primary Concordat contact. She was Alvaran, tall, pale, with a bioluminescent pattern along her jaw that shifted color based on her emotional state. She'd been working in Concordat administration for longer than my country had existed, and she had a way of delivering catastrophic information with the calm of someone discussing weather forecasts. She found me in the delegation briefing room. I was going over shipping regulation updates, something I'd been doing twice a week for 3 years. She set a datapad on the table in front of me and said, in that measured Alvaran cadence, "You should read this. I suggest you do so before your next meal rather than after." Then she left. The datapad had the reclassification proposal on it. Full text, all 417 pages of supporting documentation, species testimony, historical analysis, threat assessment modeling, and the formal proposal language itself. I read the first 3 pages standing up, then I sat down, then I read the rest of it. It took 6 hours. By the end, my hands were shaking slightly, which I noticed in a detached sort of way, like an observation about someone else's hands. The proposal wasn't punitive. That's the first thing I had to understand, and it took me a while. It wasn't the Concordat saying Earth was a threat to be eliminated or contained. It was the Concordat saying, and this is the part that's hard to fully convey, it was them saying that they had run the models, reviewed the history, analyzed the behavioral data across every Terran interaction with the galactic community over our membership period, and they could not fit us into any existing framework. Not because we were too violent, not because we were too peaceful, not because we were too advanced or too primitive. Because we were unpredictable in ways that their 11,000 years of galactic experience had no template for. The document cited 47 specific incidents. Some I knew, some I'd never heard of. There was a section on Terran biology that I found deeply unsettling to read, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was accurate in ways that felt almost clinical. Did you know that the Concordat's xenobiologists had classified humans as having pain tolerance thresholds that exceeded their model's upper parameters? That they'd had to build a separate biological assessment framework just for us? I didn't know that. The document said it like it was a minor footnote. There was another section on Terran psychology, on the concept of spite. Apparently, several Concordat species have some version of competitive behavior, some version of self-interest, some version of tribalism. But the document noted that humans had demonstrated, repeatedly, a willingness to accept personal harm in order to impose harm on someone who had wronged them, even when the mathematical outcome was negative for the human involved. They had a name for it, a Concordat term I can't easily transliterate, that meant something like retributive equilibrium seeking at personal cost. They couldn't model it, they'd tried. The section I kept coming back to, though the one I read 3 times, was the section on adaptability. Because that's ultimately what the whole proposal was about. Every major species in the Concordat had a behavioral envelope, a range of responses, a set of strategies, a way of approaching problems that was, after enough observation, predictable. Even the most complex, most advanced level 14 civilizations had recognizable patterns. Humans, the document said, had no stable behavioral envelope. Not because we were chaotic, because every time the Concordat had placed us in a situation, a crisis, a conflict, a negotiation, a tragedy, we had responded in a way that the models had not predicted, and then that response had become part of us, and the next time we'd done something different again. We didn't just adapt to problems. We changed in response to them, structurally, culturally, strategically. And 11,000 years of galactic governance had never encountered that before. The document ended with the formal proposal language. In light of the above assessment, the Oversight Committee recommends Earth's reclassification from Level 11, Emerging Galactic Presence, to Level 15, Deadworld classification, pending full committee review and vote. Level 11 to Level 15. Skipping 3 entire tiers. In 11,000 years of Concordat history, that had never happened either. The next 6 months were the strangest of my career. The Terran delegation was officially notified of the proposal, which meant I spent a lot of time in emergency communications with Earth, with our ambassador, a steady, methodical woman named Esperanza Calvo, who had the enviable quality of never visibly panicking, and with the various Concordat representatives who had opinions about what was happening. Opinions there were many of. The Alvarans, Counselor Veth's people, were quietly supportive of the reclassification. They'd been Earth's most consistent advocates in the Concordat since we joined, and they seemed to view the Level 15 proposal as a formalization of something they'd privately known for years. Veth told me, in one of our late evening conversations over Alvaran tea, which tastes like mint crossed with something electrical, that she had written a private assessment of Earth's true classification tier 7 years earlier and had placed us at Level 15 then. She'd filed it away because she knew the committee wasn't ready. The Kreth, predictably, were furious, not because they'd necessarily done the math differently, because a Level 15 Earth meant that their Gorath station move had been an even larger miscalculation than it appeared. It meant they'd picked a fight with a Deadworld and lost. That was not a history they wanted written. The Velhari, a mid-tier species I'd had mostly positive dealings with, known for their architecture and their deeply conservative approach to galactic politics, were terrified. I mean that literally. I attended a diplomatic function during that period and spoke briefly with their senior delegate, a creature whose name I'll render as Ambassador Sorath, and the bioluminescent patterns on their body, they communicate partly through light. We're cycling through what my briefing materials described as an acute stress response the entire time we talked. Sareth was polite. Sareth was professional. And Sareth was scared in a way that had nothing to do with anything I'd said. They were scared of what Earth would become once we knew what we were. I've thought about that a lot since. There were also species who were almost enthusiastic. The Drenathi, who are a younger species than most Concordat members and had something of an underdog complex in the political structure, sent us a formal message of congratulation before the vote had even happened. Their representative, a young, by Drenathi standards, she was 90, diplomat named Kassira, grabbed my arm at a reception and said, in that breathless Drenathi way, "Do you understand what this means? Do you understand what you people are?" I told her honestly that I wasn't entirely sure. She said, "It means you're real. You're the first new thing in a very long time." The hearing itself was scheduled for the 14th of March, Terran calendar, Velshara Prime, the Concordat's primary administrative world, a planet that I had visited twice before and found impressive in the way that things designed to impress always are. Everything on Velshara Prime is built to scale with the largest member species in the Concordat, which means that if you're human-sized, you spend a lot of time feeling like a child in a building made for adults. The hearing chamber seats 1,200. It was full. I've attended Concordat proceedings before. Routine ones, contested ones, a couple that had gotten heated. I'd never seen the main chamber at full capacity. 1,200 beings from across the Concordat, every seat taken, the gallery above packed with observers, media drones hovering near the designated documentation zones. Ambassador Calvo sat at the Terran delegation table. I sat 2 seats to her left. To her right was our legal counsel, a man named Dr. Arash Morandi, who had spent 20 years in interstellar law, and who had the focused calm of someone who had prepared for exactly this, and was not going to waste that preparation on visible anxiety. The committee chair was a being named Rithais of the Sarathi, a species I won't attempt to fully describe, except to say that they are old, they are large, and they have a presence in a room that I can only describe as gravitational. Rithais had chaired the Concordat Oversight Committee for longer than any living Terran had been alive. The translator rendered their voice as something deep and measured, like stones settling. Rithais called the session to order. What followed was 8 hours of testimony. I'm going to tell you about 3 specific moments from those 8 hours, because there were 1,200 beings in that room and 8 hours of proceedings, and I couldn't possibly convey all of it. But these 3 moments, these are the ones I still think about. The first was early, maybe an hour in. A Vetharan delegate, a senior military assessor named Commander Relakath, stood to present the Vetharan position, which was predictably opposed to the reclassification. They didn't want it formalized. They wanted Earth kept at level 11, kept in review, kept in a category that could be managed. Commander Relakath was an experienced speaker. He laid out the case methodically. Earth was young. Earth was unpredictable because it was immature, not because it was genuinely dangerous. The Gorath incident was an anomaly. The Kessler Corridor situation was a legal dispute, not a threat assessment data point. Earth should be guided, mentored, integrated more fully into Concordat norms before any reclassification even be considered. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he finished, Rithais invited response from the Terran delegation. Ambassador Calvo stood up. She's a small woman. I don't mean that as anything other than a physical description, small and compact. With silver hair she keeps short, and a way of speaking that is completely quiet and somehow absolutely impossible to not hear. She said, Commander Relakath's assessment that Earth is young is accurate. We are young. We've been spacefaring for less than a century. We've been Concordat members for 43 years. By any historical measure, we are new. She paused for a moment. But I want to address something the commander said, because I think it contains an assumption worth examining. He suggested that Earth's behavior has been unpredictable because of immaturity, that with guidance and integration, we would become more predictable, more aligned with established norms. Another pause. I don't think that's true, and I want to be transparent about why. The chamber was completely silent, 1,200 beings and not a sound. Earth's unpredictability isn't a developmental stage. It's not something we'll grow out of. It emerges from something fundamental about what we are and how we're shaped. We're not unpredictable because we haven't learned the rules yet. We're unpredictable because we evaluate rules against outcomes and sometimes decide the rules need to change. We have always done this. In our own history, across thousands of years of internal development before we ever reached space, we did this. It's not a bug. It's not immaturity. She let that sit for a moment. The Concordat is being asked to classify Earth honestly. We're asking you to do the same. She sat down. The chamber, I am not exaggerating here, was silent for almost 30 seconds. In a room of 1,200 beings, that is a very long time. The second moment came about 4 hours in. It was during the testimony phase, where various Concordat members were formally presenting their positions. The Kreth delegate, a massive, plated creature who I'll call Senior Advocate Rog, stood to present opposition testimony that was, bluntly, hostile. Rog's position was that the Level 15 classification was inappropriate not because Earth didn't meet the criteria, but because the criteria itself was flawed when applied to a civilization that was, in his framing, essentially an aggressive territorial species with limited galactic experience and no demonstrated capacity for long-term strategic vision. He then said something that I want to quote as precisely as I can remember it, because it matters for what happened next. He said, "The classification history of Level 15 worlds shows a consistent pattern. The 14 previous Deadworld designations were all civilizations that demonstrated overwhelming force, comprehensive territorial conquest, or technological development so rapid and uncontrolled that they became existential threats to neighboring species. Earth has done none of these things. Earth has won some small conflicts. Earth has been creative in diplomatic approaches. These are not Deadworld characteristics. These are the characteristics of a civilization punching above its weight class temporarily, before the natural forces of galactic politics bring it in line." He paused. Then, in what I think was intended as a finishing stroke, I would ask the committee to consider whether this classification is based on evidence or on fear. There was murmuring in the chamber, not disagreement exactly, more like the kind of sound a room makes when something has been said that touches a nerve. Then Counselor Veth of the Alvaran stood. She hadn't been scheduled to speak at this point. She requested the floor. Rithais granted it. Veth said, and her bioluminescent jaw pattern was completely, unusually still, which I'd learned meant she was being very deliberate. Senior Advocate Rog asks whether the classification is based on evidence or fear. I want to answer that question directly. It is based on both. And I would suggest that the presence of fear is itself evidence. She turned, very slightly, to look in the direction of the Terran delegation table, then back to the committee. In 11,000 years, this committee has classified 14 worlds at level 15. All 14 were civilizations that had already demonstrated their full destructive capacity. We classified them after the fact, once we understood what they were. In every case, we were too late to do anything except document what had happened. Her jawlight was cycling slowly now, a color I'd come to associate with something like gravity, weight, seriousness. Earth is different. Earth is here in this chamber, 43 years into its Concordat membership, with its entire potential still ahead of it. We have the extraordinary opportunity of classifying a level 15 civilization correctly, not as an epitaph, but as an acknowledgement. Not because we're afraid of what Earth might become, but because we have enough wisdom left after 11,000 years to recognize what we're looking at. She sat down. Rog didn't respond. I don't think he had a response. The third moment was the one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It was near the end of the proceedings, about 7 hours in. Most of the formal testimony had been heard. The committee was moving toward the deliberation phase. Rithais of the Sarathi called for final statements from the primary parties. Ambassador Calvo spoke for the Terran delegation. She was brief, maybe 5 minutes, and she said something that was, by her own later admission, not planned. She'd had a prepared statement. She didn't use it. What she said was, "I want to be honest with this committee about something. I've spent the last 6 months preparing for this hearing, reviewing the proposal, understanding the criteria, thinking about how to represent Earth's position most effectively. And what I've come to, after all of that preparation, is this." She looked around the chamber, all 1,200 of it. "We don't fully understand ourselves. That's the truth. Humans, as a species, are still in the middle of figuring out what we are. We've been doing that for our entire history and will probably be doing it for our entire future. We don't have it solved. We don't have ourselves categorized. We are a work in progress, and we know it, and we lean into it. What I can tell you, what I can promise you, is that whatever Earth becomes, whatever we build and discover and create in the centuries ahead, we will bring that same quality to it. We will be honest. We will be unpredictable. We will evaluate what we're doing against whether it's right, not just whether it's convenient, and sometimes we'll get that wrong, and when we do, we'll change. You're being asked to classify us. We accept that. We think you're probably right about what we are, but I want to be clear that the classification, whatever it is, doesn't change what we're going to do. We're going to keep reaching. We're going to keep showing up. We're going to keep being here, in the chambers and at the stations and in the corridors of space, because that's what we do." She paused one final time. "We're not a threat to the Concordat. We're a part of it, and that's not going to change." The chamber was silent again. Then Rithais called for the vote. The vote took 11 minutes. In Concordat procedural terms, that's fast, very fast. Votes of this significance usually involved extended deliberation. I was watching the committee panel when the result registered. I was watching Rithais specifically, because the chair's face, their face, that complex, ancient expression I'd been trying to read for 3 years, was the first place I'd see something true. Rithais looked at the result. There was a pause. Then they looked, very deliberately, at the Terran delegation table. Then they spoke. The translator rendered it. The Concordat Oversight Committee, in full session, by a margin of 31-4, hereby classifies the civilization of Earth, Sol system, as level 15 Deadworld classification. This classification is granted not as a warning and not as a weapon, but as the most accurate description available to us of what we are witnessing. Earth is the 15th civilization in Concordat history to receive this designation. It is the first to receive it as a living, intact, growing civilization. The committee notes this distinction. This chamber is adjourned. I sat in my seat for a long time after the chamber emptied. Ambassador Calvo found me there. She sat down next to me, which was not something she typically did. She usually had 17 things to do the moment any proceeding ended. We sat there together for a while, not saying anything. Eventually she said, "You okay?" I thought about it. "I don't know what I am, honestly." She nodded like that was the right answer. "Neither do I." "Then, do you know what the Dranathi word for new is? The old word, the root one?" I said I didn't. She said, "It's the same as their word for alive. In their language, they're the same concept. Something that is truly new is, by definition, alive. Something that is truly alive is always new." She stood up, straightened her jacket. Ambassador Calvo, who had represented Earth in the most significant hearing in 43 years of galactic membership, and who looked approximately as tired as someone who had done exactly that. "I think that's us," she said. "I think that's the thing." Then she went to do her 17 other things. I stayed a while longer. Through the chamber's observation windows, I could see Velshara Prime's sky, 3 moons visible in the late afternoon, the orbital stations catching the light, the great curved edge of the planet's terminator line cutting across the horizon. Somewhere behind me, behind the station, behind the planet, in the direction of an unremarkable yellow star in the outer spiral of the Milky Way, home. Level 15. The 15th civilization in 11,000 years. And the first one they'd had to look in the eye when they said it. There's a thing that happens when you work in interstellar diplomacy long enough. You stop being surprised by the paperwork. Not by the events. Events will still surprise you, sometimes violently. But the paperwork, the documentation, the endless layers of bureaucratic formalization that the Concordat generates around every significant moment, you stop feeling it after a while. It becomes background noise. Another datapad, another filing, another notation in the archive. The Level 15 reclassification generated more paperwork than anything in my career. And buried in that paperwork, in the supplementary documentation, the supporting analyses, the historical comparison files, was the material I spent 3 months reading after the hearing. The material that, piece by piece, changed how I understood not just the classification, but everything that had led to it. I want to tell you what I found. I want to tell you because I think most people on Earth don't know this story. The official narrative is simple. We got classified, it was a big deal, it means we're powerful and important. That's the headline version. That's the version that travels. The real version is weirder and deeper, and I think more true. It starts with a xenobiologist named Dr. Freth of the Velhari. Freth had been part of the original Concordat biological assessment team when Earth first applied for membership 43 years ago. Their job, along with a team of about 30 other specialists, was to assess Terran biology and determine where humans fit in the Concordat's existing biological classification frameworks. This is routine. Every new species goes through it. The frameworks are comprehensive, built up over 11,000 years, and they accommodate extraordinary diversity. In 43 years, the team had assessed over 800 new species without encountering anything that required fundamental framework revision. Humans required 3 framework revisions. The first was pain tolerance. I mentioned this in the hearing documentation, but the story behind the data is something else. During the initial assessment, the Concordat medical team ran what they called standard resilience protocols, essentially measuring where the threshold of physiological stress was for Terran biology. Standard tests, done with every new species. Humans kept going past the thresholds. Not because the tests were wrong, because humans had, and this is Freth's phrasing from the supplementary file, a decoupling between physiological damage signals and behavioral modification that was unlike anything in the existing framework. In most species, when the body sends pain signals past a certain intensity, behavior changes. Fundamentally, involuntarily, it's a survival mechanism deep-wired. The body says stop, and the organism stops. Humans, Freth found, could acknowledge the signal and continue anyway. Not in all cases, not without cost, but with a regularity and variety that the framework simply had not accounted for. Athletes, soldiers, emergency responders, parents lifting cars off children in documented cases that Freth's team had reviewed. The decoupling wasn't universal, but it was prevalent enough, and the circumstances under which it activated were varied enough that Freth had to file for a framework extension. The extension was granted after some internal debate, apparently. There was a faction on the assessment team that wanted to classify the decoupling as a defect, as evidence of biological malfunction, that Terrans had a damaged pain processing system. Freth argued successfully that it wasn't a defect because it was clearly functional. It served a purpose. It produced outcomes. It was woven into Terran social history in ways that indicated it was a feature, not a bug. The second framework revision was social bonding structure. Most species in the Concordat form social bonds based on some combination of genetic proximity, shared resource access, and long-term proximity. Some species have more complex structures. The Drenathi, for instance, have a clan system that incorporates non-genetic bonds in interesting ways. But the framework accommodated this. The framework had parameters for it. Humans formed stable, high-intensity social bonds with beings who were none of those things, not genetically related, not sharing resources, not in long-term proximity. The assessment team found documented cases of humans maintaining strong bonds across decades of separation, across geographic distances that in pre-space Terran history would have been essentially permanent, across species lines once interspecies contact became possible. This wasn't just altruism. The framework had categories for altruistic behavior. This was something more specific. Humans were forming what Freth described as personhood-based bonds, relationships that were fundamentally about the specific individual rather than any attribute of that individual. Bonds that were, in principle, transferable to anyone who had the right set of experiences and qualities, regardless of any other factor. The Concordat framework had nothing for this. It required a new category. The third revision was the one that, I think, explains everything else. And it's the hardest to describe cleanly, so I'm going to take a moment with it. The third revision was for something Freth called narrative identity. The concept requires some setup. Most species, when assessed, show a fairly consistent relationship between self-model and behavior. The way an organism understands itself shapes what it does. This is universal. But in most species, the self-model is relatively stable. It changes with experience and development, but it changes slowly, incrementally, in response to external conditions. What Freth found in Terran psychology was that humans didn't just have a self-model. They had a story about themselves, a narrative, not just a state. And crucially, this was the part that broke the framework. The narrative could be rewritten. Not just updated, rewritten. Humans could, in response to experience or reflection or even the influence of other humans, fundamentally revise the story they told about who they were. Not just add new chapters, but go back to earlier chapters and reinterpret them. They could take the same sequence of events from their past and tell an entirely different story about what those events meant, and the new story would change how they behaved going forward. No other species in the Concordat framework did this to this degree. Most species processed experience additively, new information added to the existing model. Humans processed experience narratively, new information could reorganize the entire model. Freth had filed the third revision with a note that read, in translation, "This assessment team is unable to determine the upper behavioral envelope of Terran individuals or Terran civilization, as the narrative identity mechanism creates a recursion that our models cannot terminate. Recommend ongoing monitoring." Recommend ongoing monitoring. That had been 43 years ago. I read Freth's files over about a week. When I finished, I sat quietly for a while, and then I thought about every difficult thing humans had ever collectively decided to change their minds about. Every time a civilization had said, "We were wrong about this, we're changing." Every time an individual had looked at who they'd been and decided to become someone different. We do that. We actually do that. It's not easy and it's not always successful, and it takes longer than it should, and there are always people who resist, and the resistance is sometimes awful. But we do it. I wonder what Freth made of that. The second thing I found in the documentation was the analysis of the Goreth Station incident. Not the tactical report, I'd read that. The psychological analysis. The Concordat Behavioral Assessment Team had done a deep study of Lieutenant Colonel Webb's decision-making during the 19-day standoff, and I found it in the supporting files of the classification proposal. The core finding was this: Webb's behavior during the standoff did not match any existing profile in the Concordat's military leadership database. Not because he was more aggressive than the database could accommodate, because he wasn't aggressive at all. He was, and this is the assessment team's language, oriented toward the minimum necessary action at every decision point, while maintaining complete clarity about the maximum available action. That phrase took me a while to unpack. What it meant was, Webb knew at every moment during those 19 days what the most extreme response available to him was. He had that calculation running continuously. He knew what 43 soldiers could do in extremis, and he never forgot it. And he never used it. He held back not because he couldn't act, but because he was continuously evaluating whether acting was necessary, and continuously concluding that it wasn't. Yet, the assessment team noted that this was different from passivity or restraint in the conventional sense. It wasn't that Webb was holding back out of weakness or fear or procedural caution. He was holding back because he had decided, repeatedly, consciously, that the cost of acting was still higher than the cost of waiting. And everyone in that standoff somehow understood this. The assessment team's analysis of the Kreth commander's behavior showed a pattern that the team described as escalation hesitation, a repeated pattern of preparing aggressive action and then pausing, then standing down, then preparing again. The team's hypothesis: the Kreth commander couldn't figure out the point at which Webb would stop restraining himself, and that uncertainty was worse than facing a known quantity. The assessment team called this, in their summary, the weaponization of restraint. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I thought about every negotiation I'd ever been in, every diplomatic standoff I'd ever watched, and I thought, yes, that's the thing. That's the thing that species who have been watching us can't model. They can see the ceiling of our capability and be afraid of it, or they can see us choosing not to use that capability and read it as weakness. What they can't do, what the models can't do, is sit with the uncertainty of an entity that is fully capable and fully choosing, moment by moment, in ways that don't follow a predictable gradient. Webb had known that, maybe not consciously, but he'd known it. 18 of his people had died in that standoff. I thought about that. I thought about what it costs to weaponize restraint when the cost isn't abstract, when it's real and permanent and comes back in body bags. I don't have a clean thought about that. I just have the weight of it. The third thing I found was not in the official documentation at all. It came from Counselor Veth during one of our evening conversations in the weeks after the hearing. We were talking about the classification, about what it meant, about what Earth would do with it, which was a question I was still working through. Veth was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "There is something I should tell you, something that is not in the formal record." I waited. 17 years ago there was a closed committee session, not publicly recorded. You will not find it in the archives. It concerned a species called the Athrin. I didn't know the name. The Athrin are extinct now. They were a level 14 civilization, one of the 9. They had a fleet, resources, a significant presence in the inner Concordat territories. They were powerful and they knew it. And 17 years ago, they decided to test something. They wanted to know how Earth would respond to a threat it didn't know was a threat. I kept my face still. They ran what would be described in human terms as a false flag operation, a staged crisis in Terran space. Nothing that would cause direct harm to human civilians. They were careful about that, because they were smart enough to know that direct harm would trigger a response they could predict. Instead, they created a situation that was designed to make Earth appear to be threatening a neutral party. A manufactured incident that would, if it worked as designed, result in the Concordat censuring Earth and potentially stripping certain diplomatic protections. The goal was to see if Earth could be manipulated, to find a mechanism for controlling you that didn't require direct confrontation. I asked what happened. Veth was quiet for a moment. Your intelligence service identified the operation within 11 days. We don't fully know how. We've reviewed what's available and there are gaps. But within 11 days, they had the architecture of the operation mapped. And then... She paused. And then your government did something we did not expect. Instead of exposing the operation publicly, instead of confronting the Atherin through official channels, instead of any of the things the models predicted, your government quietly, privately, with no documentation that could be later found, let the Atherin know that you knew. Nothing more than that. No demands, no accusations, no threats, just you know, we know, and then they waited. I let that settle. What did the Atherin do? They withdrew the operation. Immediately. And then, over the following 18 months, they withdrew from several other positions in the Concordat that had been constructed partly around the assumption that Earth could be managed indirectly. Not because your government pressured them to. Because they ran their models on what you'd done, on the decision not to act on the information publicly, and they couldn't determine why. And things they couldn't determine scared them more than things they could fight. The Atherin made 12 strategic errors in the 7 years following the incident. They lost their level 14 status. They fragmented. They are, today, 3 remnant populations with no significant galactic presence. We believe the initial fracture began with the incident, with what your government did, or rather, with what your government chose not to do. I sat with that for a long time. Why are you telling me this? I finally said. Veth's jawline shifted. Because I wanted you to understand that the committee voted 31-4. It was not a close vote. And the 4 who voted against the classification were not voting against it because they believed Earth didn't qualify. They voted against it because they believed documenting that Earth qualified would itself be a provocation that Earth would respond to in ways they couldn't predict. She paused. They were afraid of what you would do when you knew for certain what you were. I've been sitting with that for 3 years now. It's been 3 years since the hearing, since the classification, since Veth told me about the Atherin. Earth is level 15. We are officially, formally, on the record, the 15th civilization in 11,000 years to receive that designation. We're in the history books of every Concordat species, in their archives and their threat assessments and their children's textbooks. I've watched what happened on Earth in the years since, the way the news landed, the debates, the people who thought it was terrifying and the people who thought it was thrilling, and the people who thought we were getting too big for our boots, and the people who said finally someone sees us clearly. I've thought about what Veth said, about what the 4 dissenting votes feared. I think, and this is just my read from where I sit, having been in that chamber, I think the fear was reasonable. I think it's reasonable to be uncertain about what any civilization does when it's told what it truly is. But I think the 4 votes got it wrong. Because here's what I've watched Earth do in the 3 years since. We kept working. We kept building. We kept showing up at the stations and in the corridors and at the negotiating tables. We argued with each other about what the classification meant, because that's what we do. We argue and deliberate and sometimes exhaust ourselves on the arguing and lose track of the point for a while. We had a period of about 8 months where the political conversation on Earth about our galactic status was, frankly, kind of embarrassing. And then we course-corrected, because we always do. We sent a new generation of diplomatic corps out into Concordat space. We negotiated 3 new trade agreements and 1 significant environmental protection compact that had been stalled for 11 years. We staffed up our rapid response divisions and simultaneously cut deployment orders by a third, because we'd learned something about what presence alone communicated. We started a xenobiological exchange program with the Drenathi that their young diplomat Kassira had proposed, and that most people had assumed would never get off the ground. It got off the ground. We kept being unpredictable in both directions, harder in some places, softer in others, always reevaluating, always rewriting the narrative a little. Always alive. I got a message from Commander Dara Solis last year. We'd met a couple of times through official channels, never more than brief exchanges. The message was short. She said she'd read the public report on the Gorath Station assessment. Some of it had been declassified, and she had a question. The question was, do you think Marcus Webb knew about the weaponization of restraint thing? Do you think he understood consciously what he was doing? I thought about it for a week before I replied. I wrote back, I don't think it matters. I think he did what he did because it was right. The effect on the Kreth was a consequence. Webb was trying to keep 12,000 people alive. The rest of it, the way it landed, the way it read, the way it ended up in the Concordat behavioral database, that was downstream. That was what happened when Webb just being Webb intersected with the galactic political situation. I think that's the thing, actually. I think that's the secret, if there is one. We're not calculating the effect. We're just being what we are, and the effect comes from that. She wrote back, yeah, I think that's it. I'm going to tell you about the last thing. It happened 3 months ago. I was at Concordat Administrative Station 12, a mid-size hub station, nothing like Velshara Prime, more of a working port than a ceremonial space. I was there to finalize the paperwork on a shipping regulation dispute that had been going on for 2 years and that I was exhausted by. In the corridor outside the administrative offices, I passed a Velhari child. Velhari children are not small. Even young ones are considerably larger than adult humans. This one looked, by the developmental markers I'd learned, to be somewhere in adolescence. It was sitting in the corridor, alone, with a datapad reading. I almost walked past, then I noticed what it was reading. The datapad had the Concordat public summary of the level 15 classification hearing on it. My hearing, the one where I'd been in the room, the document that had been released to the public record. I stopped. I said in Concordat Standard, that's from last year. The young Velhari looked up at me. It looked at my uniform insignia, Terran Diplomatic Corps, which is distinct, and then back at me. It said, are you from Earth? Yes. It looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully parse. Then it said, my teacher says you're dangerous. My parents says you're the most interesting thing to happen in their lifetime. I don't know what I think. I crouched down so we were closer to the same eye level, which with a Velhari adolescent still meant looking up a bit. That sounds like a reasonable place to be, I said, not knowing yet. I've been working with humans my whole life and I still don't always know what I think either. It considered this. Then, is it true that your species can change, like change the story of what you are? Freth's framework revision. Someone had been reading the biology assessments. Yeah, I said, we do that. Does it hurt? I thought about that seriously because the question deserved it. Sometimes. Depends what you're changing. The Velhari adolescent looked at me for another long moment. Then they looked back at their datapad. Then they said, quietly, more to themselves than to me, I think that's what makes you level 15. I stood up. Yeah, I said, I think you might be right. I walked away down that corridor, past the docking rings and the administrative offices and the other species going about their business in this waypoint in the middle of space, and I thought about Earth. I thought about a pale blue dot. I thought about all the ways we'd gotten things wrong, all the things we'd had to rewrite, All the times the process of becoming had been painful and public and not pretty. I thought about Gorath Station and 18 soldiers, and a commander who'd held still in front of 200 warships, because the math on waiting was better than the math on moving. I thought about Calvo saying we will keep reaching and meaning it the way humans mean things they've tested against themselves and found to be true. I thought about Freth writing recommend ongoing monitoring 43 years ago and being correct. I thought about the Vilhari teenager asking if changing hurts. Somewhere out there, in the direction of home, Earth was doing what it does, fighting with itself and building things and sending ships out further than they'd gone before and arguing about whether it was doing the right thing, and then sometimes, painfully, slowly, doing a little bit better. We were level 15. The 15th world in 11,000 years. And unlike the other 14, we were still here. Still watching the sky. Still reaching.